I think the private sector has a driver's role in economic development now. In that sense, I believe that they must embrace new frontiers and they must start to undo some of the myths that have developed in the past. Size is no longer a constraint to economic possibilities. And in that sense, the private sector has to open, in my view, the frontiers of activity to incorporate that the world is now open and size is no longer constrained. Secondly, I think that we must recognize that economic shocks within which the Caribbean has been operating for all our history is not a transitionary phenomenon or a temporary one. It is indeed a permanent feature in our economic life. And therefore, we must find the right ways to mitigate these shocks on a permanent basis, not only by the private sector, but also by the public sector. And in that sense, we must build buffers. We must build buffers within the institution and in the public sector in order to take into consideration that the economy will always be subject to economic shocks. So in that sense, I see the private sector reconceptualizing its own role, both in terms of a wider space within which they must operate, and in terms of the internal dynamics to build resilience within the institution to mitigate against these shocks. Having said that, it cannot happen if the public sector does not play a catalytic role. And in that sense, that catalytic role is not so much, in my view, the role of setting the rules of engagement, but how do you initiate action by ensuring that there are institutions that will allow for the free movement of capital, the free movement of goods, and perhaps even the free movement of people in the region in order to embrace the opportunities ahead of us. So the private sector as a driver in this process is critical. It will need that institutional support base to do it, and it will need a redefinition of its own focus now in terms of possibilities for the world. An example of what I'm saying is that the global economy with respect to outsourcing has been growing at a very, very large rate. And perhaps it is something we should tap into as smaller economies in the region to facilitate the outsourcing industry that is growing globally. And therefore, there are many opportunities that could emerge in trying to capture that market by itself. To some extent, it requires the private sector to embrace some opportunities in which risk they will have to take, and therefore the public sector must provide the mechanism to try and ensure that that risk is shared between the private sector and the public sector by virtue of export financing schemes, by virtue of ensuring that there is indeed some kind of financial incentive for the work that they are doing. So I believe that the strategic plan of which you mentioned earlier is clearly a first chapter in a much larger framework that has to be embraced for the Caribbean and for its future. And that the role of the private sector is not so much only being an engine of economic growth as it has been guarded in the past, but being a driver of that economic growth. There are limits to the private sector involvement, and there is some kind of missing links in the public sector support. So what, as the region, we have to do is to ensure that we can take steps to remove those limits in the private sector, see where the missing links are in terms of risk-taking, in terms of securing new trading partners, and at the same time, we will need to ensure that the public sector has the apparatus in place within which they can support these risk-taking measures on the part of the private sector. But the time is now. It's unique. It is ready now for us in the Caribbean to have not the economics of scale as much as the economics of space. And that is to say, we must embrace the wider concept of the Caribbean region. At the recent forum held here in Port of Spain, there was a very insightful presentation made by the Commonwealth Secretariat in London on the Vision 2050 for the Caribbean. And what came out of this conference was essentially a redefinition of the ambition of the Caribbean. And that ambition was going to reflect itself in new horizons. There are some ideas that came out of that conference that I think are worthy of the private sector engaging now in this new role which they have defined. Now, we must recognize that unemployment and youth unemployment is perhaps our number one current problem. But that problem will only be resolved if we redefine our development challenges. For we face in the region a situation where the private surpluses, including the banking sector, continue to grow and to our credit and to our satisfaction, but the public sector deficits continue to rise. So you have a dichotomy between private sector surpluses and public sector deficits. And trying to close that gap is really what development is all about. And development for the young people, for the benefit of the young people, will require us to close that gap, but close it in a manner that allows the private sector to remain very competitive in the global environment, but don't allow the public sector to be on a sustained deficit course for all times. Because once that is so, the capacity to deal with the social welfare of the people, and youth unemployment is perhaps the most pressing one, will be reduced. So really what we are about, Dr. Henry, is how do you increase the capacity for maneuver in the economy? And that is what the strategic plan is, the administrative component of the furtherance of the integration movement, but we have to go beyond that at this stage. And it is in that context I see both the private sector and the public sector is in need of major reconceptualization of their activities in the future. But it won't happen just like that. It will happen if the right institutions are put into place, if the right framework for delivery is put into place. For instance, we do have major problems with respect to our logistics in transport, whether it's air or sea. And we recognize that there are limitations in this respect, but we will have to address that issue in order to be able to facilitate that. I was very pleased to see the experience of the Pacific Alliance countries expressed at the forum here in Port of Spain by a spokesperson from the government from Mexico, where they looked at this new and innovative way of integrating beyond borders. It involved Chile, it involved Peru, it involved Colombia and Mexico, and many other countries are looking at that very closely as a model. What they're interested in is moving people, moving capital, moving technology beyond their borders, and facilitating that by what we call new measures. And I think it's a good model that we can at least examine in the context of our Caribbean region. We are very fortunate that the Caribbean region has already embarked on widening its diplomatic space with the involvement, normalization of relations with Cuba. And we are fortunate that we are at this point. And in that sense, I believe that once we recognize that there are possibilities in looking at the Caribbean not as a place, but a space in the context of the world, we will be able to negotiate a new set of terms for the Caribbean region in the global economy.